Hey everyone, Nate with Grower's House here, and we just wrapped up our test on 315 watt ceramic metal halide lamps and trying to tease out which lamp available on the market is the best for growing plants. Now, how we conducted this test is I scoured the market and got my hands on every single 315 watt ceramic metal halide I could, with the intended use of growing plants, of course. I ended up with 10 bulbs. And from those 10 bulbs, we put them through a battery of tests, trying to keep all variables constant except for one and tease out what the spectrum of these bulbs are so that we can get as much data as possible, which we can then pass on to you for you to make a decision on which lamp is going to be best for your grow, whether it be the best output, the right spectrum, or just the best value. That decision is totally yours. We just want to provide you with the information so that you can make the educated decision. So that said, a lot of people don't know about ceramic metal halide, what it is or where it came from. I want to first and foremost get the idea that this is a metal halide lamp out of your head. Most people think metal halide lamp, okay, this is made for veg. No, that's not true. So I have a metal halide lamp here, and effectively this lamp has a different emitter than any other normal metal halide lamp, which is built of quartz, where this one, if you can see this little part inside of here, is actually made of ceramic. So the difference is this ceramic arc tube is able to withstand much higher temperatures. So higher arc tube temperatures happening right here. Many manufacturers are saying that it allows for more color stability, better lumen per watt ratios, and effectively an all-around better bulb in comparison to an HPS and metal halide when we're talking about how many photons of light you're getting to your plant in the usable spectrum per watt of input, which is really the way you want to measure efficiency for your lamps. So looking at this lamp, you'll see it's pretty small. It has a different kind of socket than usual, and you're gonna have to get a 315 specially designed ceramic metal halide reflector and or an adapter to be able to use them. So other than that, I mean, it burns just like a normal metal halide. They're essentially salts inside of the arc tube that heat up to a high temperature, and that renders a certain spectrum. But since these salts are able to heat up to such a high temperature, they're actually turned into what is most resembles like a plasma. And that plasma burns and has a certain spectrum that it gives off. And that spectrum that these things give off is much wider and better than traditional HPS and metal halide lamps. So that's why these ceramic metal halide lamps are so popular these days, because people are looking for the little edge and getting every efficiency out of their garden possible. And to be honest, ceramic metal halide is kind of the new wave of the future in terms of getting there. So let's jump into some of these results that we have. I want to show them to you because we got a little data crazy, doing some different spectral analysis, some bar graphs, and of course some light layout measurements. And we also came up with essentially our own graph of what we think the best value is for your garden in terms of overall output and price. So without further ado, let's hop into it. Okay, so let's start off looking at the spectrums of these two different lights. Really, there are two categories of ceramic metal halide lights: approximately 3000 Kelvin and approximately 4000 Kelvin. With the 3000 Kelvin, you can see that most of the intensity of the light is focused around that, I would say, 600 nanometer range. That's where it's strongest, and you see that like really orangish, almost yellowish hue that you see along with HPS light. So that's why it looks a little bit orange to your eye. And you also see when you get up more towards the IR, there's a pretty big spike there just north of, close to north of 800 nanometers, and then it drops off and there's not too much past 900. Now if we look at the 4K spectrum, you'll notice that it actually looks a little bit more full. That's because the spectrum is a little bit more broad, but when you compare these two, what you can't really see is that the 3K is more intense but the 4K has a little bit more of a broad spectrum. So that broad spectrum you see is a little bit closer to like I would say its peak is closer to around that 500 range. And that's why you see the light a little bit more as like a white light, or even what people call blue light, which more resembles even like your metal halide. And usually out of the 4200 Kelvin lights, you will see a little bit more going into the UV range. Although when we did some testing, we did see that UVs were actually pretty high in some of the 3K lights as well. So let's jump into the UV intensities for all of these. So how we measured the relative UV in this is by measuring the intensity of the light between 250 and 400 nanometers. And that's primarily going to be focusing on the UVA and UVB that these lights give off. Now, the light that did best in terms of UV was the Ushio 3000 Kelvin, which was a little bit surprising. And then the next up was the MaxPar 4200 Kelvin. So working your way down, you'll see that the difference between the lowest bulb and the highest bulb isn't significantly great. I mean, these are relatively low numbers if you're thinking of par. So I wouldn't say that these lights are a very strong UV performer, but they do provide some UV indeed. But the range between 6 and 8.6 for a light of this size is actually, 315 watts is actually really not that bad. But if you're looking for max UV, I'd say go with that Ushio. So moving on to the footprints that we did. So the footprints we have here show how this light performed in a Sun System 315 watt LEC fixture on 120 volt. So keep in mind the inside of that fixture has some pebbled aluminum in it. So when you look at these footprints, which show a center reading, a 1 by 1, the 2 by 2, 3 by 3, 4 by 4, all the way up to a 5 by 5, and the par readings at each one of those points, keep in mind that pebbled aluminum can kind of shoot light in different directions. It can scatter it a little bit. So really when you're looking at this, don't take that center reading as gospel. Really, the most important thing is to take as many measurements as possible. And in this case, when we take the measurements of each one of those perimeters and add them all up, that gives you a much more well-rounded story of how well this light's producing in the whole. I mean, when you're testing lights on a very, very scientific level, like with the best instrumentation available, using an integrated sphere, and you're measuring basically every single, we're talking multiple thousands of points that you're measuring. With here, we're doing, more than 30. So you can see if you're looking at the center, the highest reading that we got out of any light here was the Philips 3100 Kelvin, and it was pretty consistently the best across most of the readings. So taking that into account, take a look at this, noting which fixture it's in. So that's the kind of spread you're going to get. But of course, when we do our testing, we try and hold every variable constant except for one, and that's what we're testing for, which in this case would be the bulb. So we used same ballast, same height, same reflector, in the same tent. Everything was held to a standard where we feel like it was getting to the point where we're pretty scientific. So moving on to the par charts. So here's where we get into talking about the perimeters and the sums. So we sum the perimeter of each one of the 1 by 1, 2 by 2, 3 by 3, and 4 by 4, but the one that I want everyone to pay attention to most is the sum of all par for the 5 by 5 footprint, because that's the one that takes the largest sample size of measurements into account. And you can see by looking at that the Philips 3100 Kelvin looks like by far probably the best bulb, CMH bulb you can buy. It had the highest reading of all the measurements for par, and when you look at the 4200 Kelvin versions, the Philips did the best as well. Going into this, if I had to have a hypothesis, I would say that Philips would be my guess for the best bulb, and that's probably because they're really the company that designed and developed 315 and perfected, what kind of ballast to use with it and how it would work properly, and their compatibility of the two, both in hertz and the wave type of the ballast. So I would say kind of no surprise there, although it is a little bit surprising that the Philips did about, approximately what I would guess is that looks about 8% more than the next best bulb, which would be the Sun Pulse 3200 Kelvin. And although the differential between the Philips 4200K and the next best 4200K, which looks like the max bar, is not that great. We're talking a little bit closer to, maybe just under 5%. So take these readings, use them to make an informed decision on purchasing the best 315 lamp for your purposes. 315 watt ballasts are relatively similar, so which one you go with won't probably have a huge differential, but it looks like these bulbs, you can tease out that there are some differences. So use the one that either has the most UV or the most intensity or the best spectrum with this information. And if you have any questions for us, please give us a call or send us an email. And other than that, this is Nate from Grower's House. Happy growing.